did not know. And we hope that, thanks, Tammy. And we hope that that this is going to be a foundational sort of experience for all of us to move forward towards a better state of race and a better understanding of each other and our community, our neighbors, and how we all interact. So with those thanks, and because I can't remember if I was supposed to do it or if you were Ruth, I will give a shout out and a thanks to the UJA Federation. This event was made possible by a grant from UJA Federation. We're very grateful to them for their support of these kinds of programs. Ruth, please go ahead.
All right. Well, it was a year ago, almost exactly, last October, when in response to the wake-up call with George Floyd, we at the synagogue really tried to address the subject of racial injustice. Excuse me. Through Zoom, we showed a documentary about John Lewis, Good Trouble. One of our members even interviewed its director, Dawn Porter, and it was very inspiring. But much more would be needed to bring honest conversation about race to our synagogue. As good timing had it, we were helped by receiving the UJA grant. So thank you, UJA, not just for the funding, but for the hours of racial equity, diversity and inclusion training, which several of us, including Rabbi Arnowitz, were able to participate. And thank you, Rabbi Arnowitz, for your full-fledged support in this mission. So many factors shape our culture of racism that we know today. And one of the things that we were faced with is that it's an overwhelming topic, and how to address it was a daunting task. And so we did what we always do in our synagogue, is we formed a committee. So thank you to the WJC Racial Justice Committee for your thoughtfulness and your participation in getting this going today. And also agreeing to begin where racism spawned by the practice of slavery happened right here in this place that we call home. I'm indebted to the committee members who worked with me on this, Sharon Silver, Sandra Levy, Gail Marcus, Monica Friedman, and Tammy Arnowitz, who along with our guests today, Ned Benton and John Pruitts, contributed to make this a very special morning. Thank you. So quickly about our guests. John Pruitts is the historian for the village of Mamaroneck, as well as co-president of the Mamaroneck Historical Society. He comes to his passion honestly because his mother, who unfortunately died this year, Gloria Pruitts, held these posts for almost 30 years. Professor Ned Benton, our second guest, is on the faculty of John Jay College for Criminal Justice. And he's also the co-founder of the New York State Slavery Index. In researching our community's ties to the institution of slavery, both Ned and John, along with other members of our community, formed an organization that you should all know about called REALM, Recognizing Enslaved Africans in Larchmont Mamaroneck. Lastly, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge a certain graphic designer in California named Mosa Tanksley, who worked with us to collaborate on this beautiful pocket guide, which reflects the essence of today's, I don't know if you can see it, today's presentation. The concept that slavery was everywhere in our area, how do we not know? And also on the back, 10 facts that if we know nothing else, we should all understand these concepts and share them with other people in the community about what really happened here in our history. These maps or guides will be available in the synagogue for members and shortly in other places in our area, in the libraries, municipal centers, and other venues. So how do we not know? Without any further ado, I'd like to pass this on to our guests who are going to talk about slavery in Mamaroneck Township.
Good morning.
Good morning. Are you seeing the slide now?
Yep, we're good.
Okay.
Good morning. Our program, Slavery in Mamaroneck Township, has a purpose. We hope to open up the history of our fair community to its European beginnings and recognize that some of our early citizens were enslaved. Enjoy it and grow with the new knowledge. We want to thank you for the honor of speaking today. Remember when we say Mamaroneck Township, we are referring to all of Mamaroneck before the villages were ever created. The town began in 1661, the villages in 1891 and 1895. The villages did not exist when slavery was here. Ruth introduced us. One of the things that I'd like to sort of introduce to you is the New York Slavery Records Index. That's something that Ned leads. I think he is a co-director, but it is a record of enslaved people in New York. He's expanded the search to all of New England, and as well as following slave sales into the deep South from our area. It's a huge research undertaking. And with that, I'd like to introduce Ned.
Great, thank you. We later on have a link to that resource for you. I want to begin with a brief examination of some images. This is a picture from the digital collection of the Scarsdale Public Library of the marriage of James Fenimore Cooper to Susan Delancey in 1811. And if you look at it, it is a picture of the couple with the minister and the parents. Now, look at this picture. This is the actual mural in color in Mamaroneck Library. It is, the focus is still on the bride and groom, but note the people on each side cropped from the earlier image. You now, the painter intentionally included important context, several of Delancey's enslaved people. These are representations, but the relationship between these two images represents in a way what we're attempting to do today. In your mind's mural of Mamaroneck history, our goal is to encourage you to make space for the enslaved people and their sacrifices and contributions for our community. Now let's do a brief chronology of enslavement in Mamaroneck Township. In 1525, the first instance of enslavement in the New York area, and in fact in America, actually was when Esteban Gomez, who was a captain in the group of Christopher Columbus, explored the Hudson. He went up the Hudson trying to get to China, encountered some waterfalls and other obstructions and came back, wondered what to do, and proceeded to enslave 58 indigenous persons and took them back to Portugal. So the first enslaved people from the New York area were actually indigenous people. In 1626, the Dutch West India Company introduced the slave trade to New York. And in 1698, slavery is first recorded in the Mamaroneck Township census. You see Captain James Mott, William Palmer, and Ann Richbeld are recorded. Then we see 14 years later, we have 9 people enslaved in the 1712 Mamaroneck census by the British military. Here we have the 1790 census, and we now have 57 enslaved people in Mamaroneck. Now you'll notice this is the official United States Census form for 1791. And over on the right side of the form, you can see there's a column for slaves. And so the United States at that time viewed that as something that we count, partly because of some of the provisions in the Constitution about counting enslaved people as part of people for purposes of apportionment and things. The next is a comparison of 1790 slave information across jurisdictions. What you'll see is that the southern states already had high percentages, Virginia 39%, North Carolina 33%, but Brooklyn, New York, in the middle, had 33% of the people living in Brooklyn were enslaved. It was basically a set of plantations. New York enslaved 6% overall, but Mamaroneck's rate, like New Rochelle and Rye, was twice the New York State rate, because the coast of the South Shore, shall we say, was a site of a lot of enslavement. Slavery in Westchester peaked in 1771 with 3,430 people. And you'll note that the number of slaves then dropped to 1,250 people. Why would this have happened? Did we suddenly get a sense of morality and liberate the enslaved people? Doesn't look that way. We'll explain that in a moment. If we continue our chronology, in 1771, regional Quakers adopted a resolution against slavery. 1788, New York State started to regulate it. 1794, Congress outlawed slave importing and exporting nationally, but not between states. In 1799, we'll visit the law, we'll visit this more later, an act for the gradual abolition of slavery. It was gradual in that it was like having a pre-existing condition in your healthcare policy. They were gradually abolishing slavery, but you were ineligible if you were actually enslaved. They were going to provide for the emancipation eventually of the children. In 1817, the legislation set 1827 as the official end date for slavery for the people who hadn't been who hadn't been freed in 1799. Anyway, they also set 21 as the age for the indentured children. Basically, the children of enslaved mothers in 1799 were registered and required to do 25 or 28 years of service, of slave-like service, and then they would be emancipated and their children would never be enslaved. In the 1827 law, they changed that to being 21 years old. So it meant then that even though we think we eliminated slavery in 1827, actually, if you were born to an enslaved mother in 1820 and were registered, you could be required to serve until 1841. And so this was anyway, the question then is, did some of our emancipations actually amount to sales to slave traders? And did our drop in slave population in Westchester happen because of emancipation, or could it have been sales? Basically, in the 1780s, it would be, you would get a lot more money if you actually sold an enslaved person down south than if you would in New York. You could disguise the fact that you're selling an enslaved person. One way was by emancipating the person and claiming that the person was emancipated and then saying the person just left. Also, we know that Black people were victimized by kidnappings and other kinds of schemes. We can see the drop in Westchester and Suffolk County during this period. And we also, here's some examples of people who in the Louisiana slave trade database, which is a Louisiana required that all transactions involving sales of enslaved people be recorded in their counties. These are examples of people, we have 43 of them thus far, who were sold in Louisiana, but are listed by Louisiana as having been born in New York. So there's very clear evidence of people being sold south. And so the conclusion was by a famous historian, a very authoritative historian, that the conclusion is inescapable that the exodus we refer to was largely the work of kidnappers and illegal traders who dealt in human misery. John?
And it's quite obvious from what Ned just talked about that all of these transactions that he's describing had an economic basis. The people here in the North did not want to lose their assets. Now, in Mamaroneck, if you're driving around, you can see the names of a lot of the slave owners right on our street signs. You know, Griffin, Delancey, Richbell. The list is available of owners on mamaroneckhistory.org. And I'm sure you recognize the names. They are, you know, they're large families that operated in and lived in Mamaroneck, Larchmont, town of Mamaroneck, and Mamaroneck. And also you can see a link to the New York State Index on this. We can now briefly revisit the question of the slaves' pictures in the Mamaroneck Library. The one on the right is John Peter Delancey. It's an 1814 rendition by John Wesley Jarvis. The Delanceys lived on Heathcote Hill at the top. If you were to stand where the home originally was, it has got a magnificent view of Mamaroneck Harbor. It was moved around 1901, about 200 feet down to the corner of Fenimore Road and the Post Road, and is still there. It's got a restaurant in it. The Historical Society tried to buy it at one point. We're not really there at this point. But one of the reasons to preserve this building, it is one of the few surviving buildings in the town of Mamaroneck that was probably built by slave labor. There's a couple of them, all right, but that is the one that you drive by most often and probably never consider slavery. Now, the people that were enslaved by J.P. Delancey, I'll read them real quick. Nanny Pot, Tom Pot Jr., Tamar Pot, Jack Purdy, Dorothea, Lewis, George, and a child named either Anne or Nancy, Margaret, known as Peg, Tom, Simon Woodbeck, Peter and his wife, Abraham, Sam, Phoebe, Jack Purdy, Nanny, Nanny's baby, possibly Tom Pot Jr., Betty Haley, Lewis Michael, then Fred, Harriet Henry, several children, a cook, and a couple named Joseph and Harris and Angevine. Now, in the photograph, and we're speculating here based on some things that Susan Cooper described in a memoir. Fred, in the back, was described as a colored boy from Heathcote Hill and as the waiter. Delancey rented Fred in 1811 from Richard Cooper, who is James Fenimore Cooper's brother. Fred escaped in 1820. Harriet was described as the daughter of the cook who served as the chambermaid of the household. Harriet might be the same person that Mr. Delancey identifies in the town records in 1814 as Harriet with an O. Mr. Delancey registered Harriet's newborn daughter, Anne or Nancy, as required by state law at the time. The registration allowed him to retain her until 1828. We will soon learn about newborn slave registrations. Now, this is an advertisement for runaway slaves. We have 6 of them. They appear in a new book titled In Defiance, which presents more than 500 such advertisements from across the Hudson Valley. What I find interesting about these is they are describing people, their appearance, what they dressed as, what their jobs were. Now, what you see here are family records describing the purchase of 12 slaves and the sale of 3 slaves. This is the Delancey transaction record from the family. These transactions are in a handout. Peter Fellows, a local historian, recently identified these entries in the family records. In 1797, Delancey bought an entire family. Betty Haley was purchased at age 16 and was sold a year later. In 1806, he purchased Lewis, a boy who may have been separated from his family. The same possibility applies to Michael in 1809. In 1755, John Peter Delancey's father, Peter Delancey, owned male slaves named Honeyball, Tom, Tim, Sam, Lou, Jupiter, and Class, and female slaves named Susanna, Nan, Daphne, Flora, and Grace. Peter Delancey lived in what is now the Bronx. At the time, it was still part of Westchester County. But he operated Delancey's Mills on the Bronx River, immediately south of what is now the Bronx Zoo.
Now I'm going to present you some information about the Palmers. The Palmer family appears in many census documents that record enslavement. In 1695, Samuel Palmer lived in what is now Larchmont and owned 1 female slave. When Samuel died, the land was split into 4 parts for the 4 sons, and they were named Sylvanus, Solomon, Obadiah, and Nehemiah. You'll also note here that that the area which we think of as the unincorporated part of the town is referred to in this old map as Rattlesnake Hill, but we won't mention that often. Anyway, the Palmers in 1755 are listed. Nehemiah has a slave, 2 slaves, and his son had 1 slave in a colonial army survey. And so the Palmers, I mean, actually, what we think of as Larchmont was referred to sometimes as the Palmer plantations. because it really that it was a large plantation. Now we move on to Peter J. Monroe. Peter J. Monroe lived in the Manor House. He's a cousin of John Jay, the first Chief Justice of the United States. The town records show him as freeing Candace on November 19th, reporting the birth of Charlotte to Nellie in 1814. In 1808, Prince Nixon appears in the records of Newgate Prison, which is what is now Sing Sing Prison, the same site. And he was sentenced to life imprisonment for burglary. There were no white burglars who were sentenced for more than 5 years. So this is just it. There it is. In 1808, Monroe emancipated Anthony Hopper. Gilbert
Budd owned at least 14 slaves. This plaque that you're looking at is at the cemetery, the town cemetery on Mount Pleasant Avenue near the train station. He was also the town supervisor and town clerk for many years in early Mamaroneck. One thing I should mention, a lot of these people that we're talking about that were the slave owners during the Revolutionary War were on both sides of the conflict. Gilbert Budd happened to be what I'll describe as a patriot. J.P. Delancey actually led troops for the British. Peter OLeary recorded 4 slaves in the 1790 census. The OLeary's lived in what is now known as Larchmont Manor. And what appears here is the certificates of manumission for the town of Mamaroneck. The town of Mamaroneck maintains the records of slavery, including these certificates of manumission. They also identify slaves and slaveholders. Please read this escaped slave notice. And keep in mind that the person is being described possibly seeking a family or friend that she was removed from. These are real people with real sentiments and feelings, or possibly she was simply trying to be free. In this particular case, they were looking in New York City, which sort of leads me to believe that she had family there. Now on this map, you can see the names of slaveholder family names. This is from 1868. There's Palmer, Coles, Rogers, Griffin, and Merrill are some of the names that jump out at you. Now, Benjamin Griffin, the Griffins, you all know Griffin Avenue in Scarsdale, I'm sure, built one of the oldest still standing homes in Mamaroneck on Old White Plains Road. It was built in 1744 and added to in 1800. Now, this is in between those two times. So the person that ran away, James, was part of that home. The laborers that built it were most likely enslaved Africans. And this is just another one, Jack, that again, if you read the description of the person actually that ran away. They give details of what they look like, what they were wearing, and what they actually did as part of their life as an enslaved person working for the Griffins.
Go ahead, John, because this was misidentified as mine.
Okay, the names on this particular map include Gedney, Gray, Haddon, and Delancey. All right, this is a, again, all common names, street names in Mamaroneck. This is a map of Washingtonville, and the names Merritt, Haight, and Howley appear. What I find interesting in this particular map is in the top left, you see Alton Wood, okay? Alton Wood, if you've been around town for a while, the Old White Plains entrance for Wingfoot Golf Club used to say Alton Wood on it. We're talking about the Wingfoot property in that area. And again, very close to where the Griffins' home and land were. Again, we're looking at an escaped slavery advertisement, and there's plenty of them out there, all right, like we said before. And I've got to reiterate, this is a real person who ran away for a real personal reason. What that was is lost to history, but you can imagine, just if you sort of personalize it and think, what would I do? All right, guess what? I would try to run away in a heartbeat, whether it's just for freedom or to find somebody that I wanted to be with.
We're now going to turn to some records that are actually literally in the town clerk's office for the town of Mamaroneck. You can actually, if they're usually very busy, but if you make an appointment, you can actually go and you can see these actual records because they just have been continuously preserved by the town since they were created. They are the record of Black children born since 1799, when the gradual emancipation law took place. And you can see down below here the actual, I've made little copies of all of the notations. I went through a little bit about the gradual abolition law, and so I'm not going to restate it, but basically if an enslaved mother had a child, the child would not be enslaved, but instead would be indentured for 25 years if a woman, 28 if a man, and then would be emancipated. And this was to attempt to mitigate the cost to the slaveholders of an end of slavery. Massachusetts just ended slavery, period, but we did it slowly, as did New Jersey and Connecticut and Rhode Island. You also could, the slave owner could abandon the child. And we have one record of that in Mamaroneck. And abandonment meant that the child was taken away from the mother and turned over to the overseers of the poor as if this was an orphan. And then the state paid for the upkeep of the child. And anyway, this was so here are the names of the children that are on that list. And so you can see the names of the parents and the names of the children and the claim for the years of service. And also a child named Plato was abandoned and placed in the custody of the overseers of the poor without even mentioning the name of the mother. So now I'll go back to John to give us a deeper introduction to several enslaved people.
Jenny and Billy are two enslaved people in Mamaroneck that we happen to have quite a bit of information on. And I'll share with you why in a little bit. Billy Banjo and Ginny and the notations in the census of 1810 indicate that James Mott owned 3 slaves. James Mott owned the premium mill on the border of New Rochelle and the town of Mamaroneck and Larchmont near the manor. If you know where Red Bridge is, it's in that area. Billy and Ginny also appeared as characters in Mary McGanahan's story, Raid at Red Mill, which tells the story of the Mott family living through the Revolutionary War. The 2 slaves also appeared in the memoirs of Richard Mott, the grandson of James Mott. We're pretty certain that Billy and Ginny were manumitted after the Quaker decided slavery was wrong. The Quakers, excuse me. They did not free their former owners, however, and stayed with them till they died. They raised 4 generations of Motts. The Mott family, being Quakers, although they did own slaves to run the mill, were dedicated to their opposition to slavery. In this slide, it shows what he did, having purchased of Joshua Purdy, a Negro man named after Andrew, who is built about 26 years of age. He has the promise of the person I brought from that he should be free at 28 years of age. And as one object I had in view in purchase was to secure his freedom. I do hereby declare the said Andrew to be a free man from the date here of Mamaroneck 15th of May, 1811. This was after the war, all right? And this was pretty much just at the point that they were going to be selling their mill. This watercolor by Robert F. Mott from about 1814 appeared in the Adam and Ann Mott family history, published in the late 1800s, where many of the things about Billy and Ginny and stories about them came from. This is the book that most of those stories are from. It goes through much of Billy and Ginny's life, and there are some very interesting, cute, and amazing stories in it. And this is Adam and Ann, I believe from about the 1870s. Now, Billy was born about 1738. His parents, Tom and Carrie, being slaves of Thomas Bone of Long Island. For a while, he was assigned to a neighbor. He married Ginny around 1760. In 1769, he was traded for another enslaved person so that Ginny and Billy would not be separated, and they began to live at the mill house in Mamaroneck. So they basically came from Long Island to Mamaroneck. He died in 1826. Well, what's playing now, it's kind of low, I can barely hear it, is some banjo music played on a gourd banjo. That is something that Billy Banjo made. They were made out of gourds, a very simple African instrument that I'm sorry you can't hear it as well as you should. It's got a quite a good resonance to it. Now, Ginny was landed from a slave ship from Africa about 1744. The New York slave market, she was bought by Samuel Underhill, the grandfather of Ann Mott, who wanted the little slave girl to wait on his wife, Ann Carpenter Underhill, and their children. She married Billy in 1860. And I made a mistake before, I said 1760, it's 1860. And then, no, I'm sorry, it's 1760. In 1769, began to live at the mill house. She was the mother of 9 sons and 1 daughter, and she died in 1818. The slave ship that she came over in, David, came into New York in July 1744. There was 181 enslaved people who started the voyage. 26 died, 155 survived. One of the things that I find interesting about this whole time period is that New York became a center for employment of slaves, but it ended. And what happened is it all reverted to Rhode Island in the northern hub for slave trade later in time. And Rhode Island became the main hub for these things. But Ginny talked about being a daughter of a bigwig, a king, or of some kind in Africa. Most early African slaves at the time were imported directly to New York, and a stigma was associated with them. And the reason being is that they were not used to, allowed, they did not have a conception of slavery. They were free people in Africa. According to Charles Swain in his book, The History of African Americans in New York State, slaves purchased from the Caribbean with his hard slave master made much more stable workers than people that were brought over directly from Africa. This story here, if you read it, is kind of cute and gives you an idea of what Billy was actually like and how Ginny and Billy interacted. If Billy chanced to omit any part of a story, Ginny would break in to correct him and was apt then to go on with it herself. And whatever could rebound to Billy's credit was always dwelt upon with proud satisfaction. And more in detail than ever was Billy's habit of telling the same thing not that she romanced at all, but had a womanly knack of showing him off in the best light. This little story is a Revolutionary War period story told by Ginny about Billy. The Fade Merritt, excuse me, was a what was known as a cowboy, all right, which was a British leaning crook. What he did was he stole things from the farmers of the area, and to feed the British troops. But it's kind of cute the way that this little story shows how Ginny and Billy appreciated each other and protected each other.
All right, we're running a little late. I'm going to move quickly here, but I'm going to tell about two additional people from Mamaroneck, John Cox and Andrew Cole. Basically, during the Revolutionary War, the British eventually said that if an enslaved person ran away to the British side, that however the war came out, they would be emancipated. And so two people who escaped from Mamaroneck are John Cox and Andrew Cole. And we think that John Cox was owned by Eliezer Godden, or Eliezer Gedney, as we think the real name. And Andrew Cole was probably related to Ben Cole, who was a cobbler. They both joined up with the British forces. After the war in 1783, the Treaty of Paris, which resolved the war, said that enslaved people serving under the British could come to New York and be shipped to Nova Scotia. This, what's called the Book of Negroes, is actually the ship registers. Now, there's some big time names in the Book of Negroes registers. For example, you see here Henry Washington, the slave of General Washington, and Massey, the slave of John Jay. So in this registry, we have the first president and first Supreme Court justice, both recording escaped enslaved people and seeking compensation for them. Aboard the Clinton, there was John Cox, and aboard the Clinton, there was also Andrew Cole. And you'll see the records. We see that they were supposed to go to Annapolis, but apparently they went to St. John. There were children with them. There was a anyway the people with the same name on the ship. And so we think that the people in Nova Scotia and in Canada have traced back some of these people, and so that they think they know something about the families of John Cox and Andrew Cole. The place where they lived is now cited as a historic place. It's called Little Negro Lake, but they're changing the name of it now. They're going to name it after one of the enslaved people who lived there. Actually, all of the people who emigrated to Canada and are listed in the Book of Negroes are celebrated in a memorial in a museum in Nova Scotia, including the two enslaved men from Mamaroneck. So they are being celebrated in Nova Scotia, and it might be time for us to celebrate them a bit here in Mamaroneck. John?
And which brings us to REL, recognizing enslaved Africans of Larchmont, Mamaroneck. We are an organization that is dedicated to commemorating these people that were slaves. Engage the community in creating a memorial to recognize the enslaved people, and develop plans for educational programs in conjunction with the memorial, as well as to raise funds for the installation of a permanent memorial. Now, the memorial proposed site is right across the street from you all at the town center. The picture there shows the hill just to the, if you're on the post road, the right side of the town center. We've been working with the town of Mamaroneck and selected a site to place the memorial. The donations may be given on the Mamaroneck Historical Society website in Realm's name. That's mamaroneckhistoricalsociety.org. Thank you for your consideration and your interest. Thank you.
And now we're available to take questions.
Thank you so much. I'm going to bring in some of the questions that were sent to me. The first question that I got was, do any of our town's new murals depict slave owners?
Oh, you mean the ones that were put up? I guess John could answer that, I think.
The new murals in Larchmont and Mamaroneck, I assume. I would say no.
I think not,
None of them do. There is one down on Hoyt Avenue.
Judy says two do. One does.
Which one?
Which one?
Well, the one coming down the post road that shows the African woman also shows probably.
Okay, well, there's one that shows an African woman, but
It also shows a Caucasian man, supposedly, one would suggest.
okay. Anyway,
Probably so,
there is apparently one.
at least one.
All right, the one on the post road in Larchmont?
On the,
And there's also
on
one
the
by
post road.
Anderson's. I think so.
okay, anyway, yes, the one on the post road in Larchmont.
And the one with the woman with the, it's supposed to be the Palmers. That's supposed to be.
Yes, okay, good. That's the best we can do.
Okay, the Palmer one, yes, that's true. The ones in Mamaroneck, no.
Okay,
There's one on Hoyt Avenue that shows the skinny house. That has nothing to do with enslaved people.
thank you. There's a question about were enslaved people used mostly as household servants or for other forms of labor? And tied to that, what were the main economic uses of land in Mamaroneck in the 17th and 18th century?
Well, they were both used, I mean, in the plantations, they were used for labor. And in general, I mean, they were used for labor, but there were in some families, they were household labor, such as some of the Delancey enslaved people were for the household, but many of them were working particularly in the farms.
Yeah, most of them, any stone wall building, all right, that type of thing, any manual labor. If enslaved people were present, that's what they were there for.
And what were the plantations doing as a follow-up to that question?
Well, they were, I think the one in the Palmer plantation had large orchards. But there were, there was a variety of different attempts to make to create plantations in Westchester and in Brooklyn, but generally the whole idea shifted to the south. And so really there wasn't that much of it.
Okay. Next question is, has Realm looked into finding out who is descended from these enslaved Africans, and if any of them still live in Mamaroneck or Larchmont?
Let me answer that one, Ned. We have not found anyone. However, just the other day, one of our members in Realm mentioned that She may have contacted somebody that was a member of an enslaved family. We don't know the name yet, all right? So I'm not going to sit there and say definitely yes. All that I can say is this is the first time that I've heard of anyone with that connection.
I would also say that it's really very difficult for Northeastern enslavement to trace back genealogy, because many of the enslaved people only had one name. And the women then, if they did get married, we would have no idea who they married. And so, you know, it's difficult to say, but there are names like the Purdy name is a name, but whether the Purdys are the same Purdys or I mean, you know, we can speculate, but it's very difficult to do genealogy, say, compared to the South, where when the Civil War ended slavery on the plantations, then you were like 40, 50 years later, and conceivably someone might be known by someone in 1910 or something, you know, I mean, there might be some connections.
There's a couple of questions that relate to enslaved Africans escaping or the abolitionist movement. So I'm going to kind of give them all to you at once, and then you can see they kind of interact with each other. So there's basically three. I'll give all three to you. One was curious about what the abolition movement looked like in Mamaroneck throughout this time, and if freed Black people stayed in the area or moved to areas that would offer more opportunity. Similarly, if a person escaped enslavement, what were their chances of remaining free, and what were their lives like? And what role did the African church, i.e. Barry Avenue AME Church, play in either helping freed enslaved people or as an institution for freed formerly enslaved people? So you can touch on all of those.
Okay. There's little record of abolitionism. There are a lot of myths about abolitionism in Mamaroneck and Larchmont, but there's little record of it. And we're indexing in the Northeast Slavery Records Index all the abolition records and the Underground Railroad records that we can locate. And we have, for some jurisdictions, large numbers of people who were Underground Railroad agents, and we can name people who were rescued with the Underground Railroad, but the records do not turn up for Mamaroneck town, which leads me to think that it wasn't a center of that. There's more of it in other places. Now I'm forgetting the other two questions. I certainly don't know anything about the church.
Yeah, the church developed after all of this went down. There was no church that existed, you know, the Revolutionary War, for instance. All right, so no, that one would have nothing to do with that. And what was the third part?
Oh, where did they go?
Right.
The answer is that when we've looked at names of enslaved people and attempted to identify them in subsequent census tracts, census documents, we don't find them, which may mean that they, you know, the women got married, changed their names. It may be, you know, but we certainly don't find. There is an area in Rye where there was a place where Black people lived, but we're not able to trace they just disappear, which is concerning, but we don't find them.
What I'm going to do at this moment, it's 11:05. So if there's anyone who feels that they need to go, I'm going to pause and just say thank you so much to everyone who's attended. There are a few more questions, and that was my reminder to stop that. Ned and John, if you can hang out for a few more minutes, there's a couple more questions.
We'll be delighted.
Wonderful. But everyone, you know, just so you know, we're going to go on for a few more minutes with some of the remaining questions. But for those who have to get off at the hour mark, thank you so much for coming and being a part of this morning with us. It's really important information. Please remember that the guides are available. They are just a wealth of information and will point you towards further information if this is something you'd like to explore more. Okay, a couple more questions for you, Ned and John. Do you know if there's a similar history of enslavement in other areas of Westchester County?
Yes, absolutely. What you can do if you go to, and it's the link is actually in a PDF of our slides, but if you go to nesri.us, very simple link, nesri.us, that is the Northeast Slavery Records Index. If you then, you'll see there's a link to New York, and then you'll get into the New York section of the Slavery Records Index. And then in there, you'll see a set of links to custom reports. So you can see New Rochelle's report, you can see Albany, you can see all sorts of places. And in there, there is also the ability to create a custom report for any county or any locality, including, we do it all the way from New Jersey up to Maine. And so you can see Boston, you can see Suffolk County, you can see New Haven, you can see New Hampshire. It's shocking. I thought that I thought like Vermont, they wouldn't have, but in New Hampshire, you find these two clusters of enslavement. One is Portsmouth, where they were making ships. And the other was way higher up in the north in New Hampshire, where they had a plantation which basically harvested logs to make slave ships. And so anyway, you can see these enslavement records from all of the northeastern states and analyze them in these reports.
And there are pockets along the Sound Shore of slave and free Black places that run from Greenwich through Pelham, all right, that are kind of interesting to, the one in Greenwich, for instance, one of the names that is recurrent there is a name from a family that did live in Mamaroneck, all right? And these free Blacks were from 1800 on. So I found that very interesting as well.
I'm glad you mentioned the freed Black community. There was a question about that. Do we know much about the free Black community that was in our area? I think there was, I'm trying to go back, there was a question specifically that also mentioned an area where they were living. Sorry, there's so many messages back here.
There's an area up in the border of Scarsdale where Quaker Ridge Golf Course is. That was a free Black community of note, that homes were built along Old White Plains Road right there. The Purdy's, as a matter of fact, was a big name from that area. And there are people in Mamaroneck that were related to them that we do know about, but they were free Blacks. They were not enslaved Blacks.
Also, it's in New York, even back to the earliest periods when the corporation was running New Amsterdam. New York had both free Black people and enslaved Black people, and that continued. And so, as a result, many people who sought freedom from the South would attempt to get to New York because they would at least immediately blend in. And then they would find the Underground Railroad houses, the agents, the people that would help them, and they would then get sent further up. So New York was a destination, New York City was a destination in the Underground Railroad because there were free Black people actually also in 1827, when they finally so-called ended enslavement, 90% of the Black people in New York State were already free. At that point, 10% were still enslaved, and then they were freed at that point, unless they were the indentured servant people, in which case that was a different story.
And there was a specific question about Mamaroneck with involvement in the Underground Railroad. You mentioned New York City. Do we know of any spots, homes, et cetera, within Mamaroneck that were part of the Underground Railroad?
No, absolutely. Unless you've got new information, John, I know of no instance. I know of lots of stories of tunnels under Palmer Avenue and Post Road and so on. But I mean, we do at John Jay, we're indexing the records of the Underground Railroad. We've got an index of the houses in New York City that were the properties of the Underground Railroad. We've got lists of names of people who were freed with the assistance of the Underground Railroad, and nothing shows up referring to Mamaroneck. I mean, where we have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of records of sending people to Syracuse or Boston or Albany or whatever, nobody says, and we sent them up to Mamaroneck.
And there's a question, if you could just sort of clarify this space between indentured servitude and slave and servant, just clarify that timeline and what it meant for the actual people who were in those categories.
It's interesting, often, particularly when you go up to the Massachusetts records, people frequently referred to enslaved people as servants because it was a more polite word, but they were still enslaved people. A lot of church records would refer to baptizing servants and so on, but that's not what was happening. There were enslaved people, and then the indentured servants were under the 1799 law, they were the children of enslaved mothers after 1799, who then, unlike before 1799, the children of enslaved mothers were the property of the slave owner. After 1799, they were registered as the indentured servants of the slave owner, and they were then going to be free after 25 or 28 years of service. This, you can look at that and say that's a terrible idea. But on the other hand, it did mean that the children of the enslaved mother would ultimately be free, and the grandchildren of the enslaved mother would never be enslaved. And so it was a change that eventually there were various laws that accelerated the emancipations that were made possible, but that was the way in which so unlike, say, New Jersey did a gradual emancipation law in the same time period, but they kept delaying the emancipation so that they were still indentured servants and enslaved people in 1840 and 1850 in New Jersey, whereas New York acted sooner, but not as soon as Massachusetts.
Wonderful. I think we've had a couple people ask about copies of your presentation. And I wonder if we could get a version of it, a PDF that we could actually just put on our website.
I sent one this morning just before we started to Ruth, and I asked her to do something, whatever she wanted, to make it available. But it's a PDF, and we will also put it up on the Realm site.
Okay. I think we can probably host it on our site as a downloadable form, but we'll find out about that.
Ned, if you could just check to make sure that the attachment was on there, because my email from you did not have it.
So it'll definitely be on the Realm site, and most likely will also be available on our site.
Right. I will make sure and communicate with Ruth. Ruth, let me know if you got it or if I didn't attach it.
Ruth, you're muted.
Hold on a second.
It's okay.
What?
It's okay.
Ned?
I'll send, did you get it or I'll send it to you?
No, I'm asking, would you be kind enough to send it
Yes,
again?
please, I will. I thank you. Thank you. Sorry, I thought I sent it and I didn't. I'll send it right
And-
away.
And this has been recorded as well, so it will be available too. And Ruth, I'm going to pass the baton to you to just do a final thank you, etc.
Yes, okay. I would like to thank everybody for taking the time this morning to listen to this. It's really a big deal because this is not anything that we've been taught. It was a history that was omitted. And by hearing it this morning and bearing witness to it and the stories of these enslaved people, in some way, I think that in our collective consciousness, we have improved the possibility of restorative justice. And if you could just take the moment in your lives to share this with people that you know, neighbors and relatives and friends, I think that we will be in good stead to begin our work, both as a community and as a Jewish community, to see how the facts that we learn today relate to the events that we are dealing with and the state of our nation. What are the dots? You know, I think we're going to be exploring that, and maybe we can all give that some more thought. So have a good day, and thank you again for logging on to this program.
One last thing for anyone who missed the beginning, this is part of a series of programs. So if you found this interesting, make sure that you keep an eye out for our future programs that will continue to explore these issues on through time.
Thank you very, very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.